In the spring of 1885, Beatrice Alden was a woman desperately seeking a shield. She lived in Richmond, Virginia, in a grand, crumbling house that smelled of old dust and faded aristocracy. Her family had once been wealthy, but the war and poor investments had left them with nothing but a prestigious last name and an absolute lack of currency. Beatrice was 28, unmarried, and terrified. She had been raised to be a parlor ornament. She played the piano, she spoke conversational French, and she knew exactly which fork to use for oysters. She knew absolutely nothing about survival. As the bank prepared to foreclose on her family's home, Beatrice made a cold, calculated decision. She opened a matrimonial gazette and searched for a man who already owned the world. She found an advertisement from a man named Gideon Hayes. Gideon's advertisement was not a plea, it was a proclamation. He owned a massive cattle ranch in the Colorado Territory. He described a sprawling, prosperous operation, a 2-story timber house, and a life of rugged abundance. He was 35 years old, successful, and he wanted a refined Eastern woman to bring civilization to his home. He wanted a wife who would manage the domestic sphere while he conquered the land. He promised to be the ultimate provider. He promised absolute security. Beatrice wrote to him. Her letters were elegant, polite, and entirely focused on her desire to be a dutiful, traditional wife. She did not mention her family's crushing debt. Gideon wrote back, detailing the strength of his herd and the safety of his valley. He did not mention the brutal, lethal volatility of the West. They agreed to marry upon her arrival. Beatrice packed her silk dresses, her mother's silver tea set, and her expectations. She boarded a westbound train, leaving the collapsing ruins of her old life behind, firmly believing she was traveling toward a man who would carry all her burdens. She expected a towering protector waiting on the platform. She found an empty station. When the train hissed to a halt at the desolate, windswept depot in Colorado, Gideon Hayes was not there. Instead, a grim, filthy ranch hand driving a battered buckboard wagon spat tobacco into the dust and told her to get in. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't offer his condolences. He simply looked at her immaculate, deep burgundy traveling dress with a mixture of pity and absolute contempt. "The boss had an incident," the hand muttered, snapping the reins. The ride to the ranch took 4 terrifying hours. Beatrice sat on the hard wooden bench, the dust coating her expensive velvet hat, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Where was her grand arrival? Where was the strong, smiling gentleman who had promised to shield her from the harshness of the world? When the wagon finally pulled into the courtyard of the ranch, the dread turned to sheer panic. The 2-story timber house was there, but it was eerily quiet. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. The cattle dogs were tied up and barking frantically. The hired hands were sitting on the porch rails, smoking, doing absolutely nothing. Beatrice stepped down from the wagon. She did not wait for an escort. She pushed open the heavy front door and walked into the house. The smell hit her first. It was not the smell of a prosperous, civilized home. It was the sharp, metallic stench of old blood, sweat, and sickness. She walked into the main bedroom. Gideon Hayes was not a towering protector. He was a broken man. He lay in the center of a large wooden bed, his face the color of wet ash. 3 days earlier, his horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole at full gallop. The animal had rolled, crushing Gideon's right leg and shattering his ribs. He had lain in the dirt for 6 hours before his men found him. The leg was splintered with crude, blood-stained boards, and a vicious fever was radiating off his body, making him sweat through the heavy blankets. He opened his eyes as she walked in. They were dark, pain-glazed, and completely stripped of pride. He looked at the elegant, refined woman standing in his doorway, the woman he had promised a life of secure comfort. He tried to speak. He tried to offer an apology. A ragged, wet cough tore through his chest, leaving him gasping for air, clutching his broken ribs in agony. Beatrice stood frozen. The illusion of the frontier provider shattered into a million irreparable pieces in that exact second. She was a woman who had never boiled her own water. She had crossed a continent to find a husband to manage her life. She had found a dying man. For one long, agonizing minute, Beatrice Alden stared at the man in the bed. Her mind screamed at her to turn around, to run back to the wagon, demand a ride to the station, and beg the conductor for a ticket back to Virginia. She could be a governess. She could be a maid. Anything was better than being trapped in a house smelling of death, married to a corpse, surrounded by a wilderness that wanted to kill her. She looked at the door. Then she looked at the heavy, leather-bound estate ledger sitting on a small table near the bed. A pioneer woman named Molly Dorsey Sanford, who had traveled the high plains a decade earlier, wrote a brutal, honest truth in her diary. She wrote, "The romance of the West is a fiction written by men in the safety of the East. The reality is that out here, a woman must often become the exact man she was hoping to marry, or she will perish." Beatrice walked over to the small table. She did not run. She did not. She picked up the leather ledger. It was heavy. It was the weight of a kingdom. She turned to the grim ranch hand who had followed her into the hallway. "Who is managing the men?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Nobody, ma'am," the hand replied, shifting uncomfortably. "Foreman quit yesterday when the boss got the fever, figured the ranch was dead. Rest of the boys are just waiting to get paid out before they ride off. And who is tending to his injuries? Cook changed the bandages yesterday, but the leg is turning black, ma'am. He ain't gonna make the week." Beatrice took a slow, deep breath. The parlor girl from Richmond died in that exhale. She took off her expensive velvet hat and placed it on the chair. She unbuttoned the cuffs of her immaculate burgundy dress and rolled her sleeves up to her elbows. "Boil water," Beatrice commanded. Her voice was no longer shaking. It was sharp, cold, and carried the undeniable authority of a woman who had just realized she had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Bring me every clean sheet in this house, and tell the men on the porch that if they steal so much as a single horseshoe while I am working, I will shoot them myself." The ranch hand stared at her, stunned. He looked at her delicate, pale hands. Then he looked at the absolute, terrifying resolve in her eyes. He nodded, turned, and ran for the kitchen. Beatrice walked to the side of the bed. Gideon watched her through the haze of fever, his chest heaving. "I am sorry," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I promised you a home." "You promised me an empire, Mr. Hayes," Beatrice said, her hands moving quickly to untie the blood-soaked bandages on his leg. "And I intend to collect on that promise. You are not permitted to die today. Do you understand me?" Gideon didn't have the strength to answer. He passed out from the pain as she ripped the bandages away. The first week was a descent into a specific kind of hell. Beatrice did not sleep. She lived in a constant, horrifying rotation of boiling water, scrubbing infected flesh, forcing willow bark tea down Gideon's throat, and desperately trying to decipher the complex, chaotic accounting of the cattle ranch. She discovered quickly that Gideon's injury was not the only crisis. The ranch was bleeding money. The former foreman had been stealing supplies. The herd needed to be moved to the lower winter pastures in less than 10 days, and the remaining 5 ranch hands were on the verge of mutiny, refusing to take orders from an Eastern woman in a silk dress. On her 4th day, the crisis boiled over. Beatrice was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands stained with dried blood and lye soap, desperately auditing the ledger. The door kicked open. 3 of the ranch hands walked in. They were dirty, armed, and entirely disrespectful. The tallest one, a man named Cobb, threw his hat on the table, right on top of her ledger. "We're done waiting, lady," Cobb said, leaning over her. "The boss is dead meat. Winter's coming. We want our wages paid out in full, right now. And since we know there ain't no cash in the safe, we're taking 40 head of cattle as our severance." It was a blatant robbery. They knew she was isolated. They knew she had no power. Beatrice did not stand up. She did not scream. She slowly closed the heavy leather ledger. She reached into the deep pocket of her ruined burgundy dress, pulled out the heavy, oiled Colt revolver she had taken from Gidge's nightstand that morning, and placed it gently on the center of the wooden table. The metallic clack of the steel hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. The men froze. Beatrice looked up at Cobb. Her eyes were completely hollowed out by exhaustion, making her look far older and far more dangerous than the woman who had arrived on the train. "You are owed $30 a month, Mr. Cobb," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper. "According to this ledger, you have drawn an advance of $15 for whiskey in town. You are owed exactly $15. You are not taking 40 head of cattle. You are taking $15, which I will pay you from the emergency lockbox. And then you will ride off this property. If I see you within a mile of my herd, I will not ask the sheriff to handle it." She placed her small, calloused hand over the grip of the heavy revolver. "Am I making myself entirely clear?" Cobb looked at the gun. He looked at her eyes. He realized, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that this woman was completely unhinged by exhaustion and fear, and she would absolutely pull the trigger. He swallowed hard, picked up his hat, and took a step back. "Clear, ma'am. Good. Tell the others." Anyone who wants to leave takes their cash today. Anyone who stays takes my orders tomorrow. Now get out of my kitchen." 3 men left the ranch that day. 2 stayed. Beatrice Alden had secured her kingdom. In the master bedroom, the fever began to break. Gideon Hayes floated up from the dark, agonizing depths of unconsciousness. The pain in his leg was a dull, throbbing roar, but the blinding heat was gone. He opened his eyes. The room was clean. The bandages on his leg were fresh, smelling of sharp carbolic acid. He turned his head. Beatrice was asleep in a wooden chair next to the bed. Gideon stared at her. He hardly recognized the woman from the tin-type photograph he had received months ago. The elaborate, curled hairstyle was gone. Her hair hacked short with sewing shears to keep it out of her way. Her expensive dress was a ruined, stained rag. Her face was gaunt, and her hands broke his heart. They were covered in blisters, burns from the stove, and deep, dark stains from working with leather and lye. He had wanted a parlor ornament. He had wanted a soft, compliant creature to decorate his home. He had brought her into a nightmare, and she had fought the devil himself to protect his home. Beatrice stirred, feeling his eyes on her. She woke up, blinking against the pale afternoon light. She saw that his eyes were clear. She didn't smile. She didn't weep with relief. She simply sat up straight, picked up a small notebook, and looked at him. "You have lost 10 pounds, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice strictly business. "The fever has broken, but the doctor from town says you will not put weight on that leg for at least 2 months. In the meantime, I have fired 3 of your hands for attempted theft. We are moving the herd to the lower pasture on Thursday. I have renegotiated your grain contract with the mill in town because you were overpaying by 12%. Gideon lay perfectly still, listening to her. The absolute staggering magnitude of what she had done over the last 10 days washed over him. He was a proud man. He was a man who defined his entire worth by his physical strength, his ability to dominate the landscape, and his capacity to protect. To be lying in a bed, helpless, while a woman from the East saved his life and his fortune, should have been the ultimate emasculation. It was not. Instead of shame, Gideon felt a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. He looked at her ruined hands. He looked at the heavy ledger in her lap. "You moved the herd?" he rasped, his voice weak. "I will be moving the herd," she corrected him. "I have hired 2 local boys from the town. I will ride the flank myself. You will stay in this bed and drink the broth." Gideon slowly closed his eyes. A small, weak smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. It was an absolute surrender of power. The dynamic of the marriage was forged not in romance, but in crisis. When 2 people are forced into a crucible of survival, the masks burn away. You cannot pretend to be a helpless damsel when you are negotiating the price of winter wheat. You cannot pretend to be an invincible protector when someone else is washing your fevered body. A frontier historian named Evelyn Cameron once noted the profound shift in Western marriages. She wrote, "The women who came west expecting to be sheltered quickly learned that shelter is an illusion. The successful marriages were not between a master and a servant, but between 2 generals who had fought a war together and survived." By late November, the first heavy snows began to fall over the Colorado Territory. Gideon was finally out of bed. He was confined to the house, using a heavy wooden crutch to move around, his right leg stiff and healing slowly. The physical weakness frustrated him, but the psychological shift in the house was undeniable. Beatrice was the master of the estate. She did not ask for his permission. She asked for his counsel. When the cattle buyers came from Chicago, they sat at the kitchen table. They instinctively looked at Gideon to negotiate the price per head. Gideon didn't say a word. He simply leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his coffee, and nodded toward his wife. Beatrice would open the ledger, look the buyers dead in the eye, and ruthlessly dismantle their low offers until they agreed to her price. Gideon watched her do this with a quiet, fierce pride. He had ordered a wife. He had received a sovereign. The defining moment of their new reality came in the dead of winter. It was a bitterly cold night in January. The temperature had plummeted, and a pack of starving timber wolves had descended from the mountains, probing the edge of the lower pasture where the vulnerable calves were bedded down. Gideon woke up to the frantic, high-pitched barking of the cattle dogs. Instinct, forged by 20 years on the frontier, took over. He threw off the blankets, grabbed his Winchester rifle from the corner, and tried to sprint for the door. His broken leg buckled instantly. He crashed heavily to the wooden floor, the rifle skittering across the room. Pain shot through his healing bones like white-hot lightning. He cursed bitterly, dragging himself up by the edge of the bed, feeling the suffocating, terrifying panic of a man who cannot defend his own home. He was the protector. He had to be the protector. He managed to grab the crutch and pull himself to the window, peering out into the freezing, moonlit night, expecting to see a massacre. He stopped. Out in the snow 50 yards from the house, a figure was standing between the timberline and the herd. It was Beatrice. She was wearing Gideon's heavy buffalo coat over her nightgown. Her feet were shoved into heavy leather boots. She was holding a double-barreled shotgun. She didn't look frantic. She looked like a statue carved out of ice. 2 massive wolves broke from the tree line, sprinting toward the panicked calves. Beatrice didn't flinch. She raised the heavy shotgun to her shoulder. The recoil of the weapon in the quiet night was deafening. A massive flash of fire lit up the snow. The lead wolf went down instantly, violently tumbling into a snowdrift. The second wolf skidded to a halt, terrified by the thunderous noise, turned, and bolted back into the darkness of the trees. Beatrice stood perfectly still for a long moment, watching the tree line. She broke the barrel of the shotgun, ejected the smoking shell, and slid a fresh one into the chamber with a sharp, mechanical click. She turned around and walked back toward the house. Gideon stood by the window, leaning heavily on his crutch, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched his wife walk through the snow. He realized in that exact moment that he had been entirely wrong about what a marriage was supposed to be. He didn't need to shield her from the world. The world needed to be shielded from her. The heavy front door opened. Beatrice walked into the bedroom, shaking the snow off the heavy buffalo coat. She smelled of gunpowder and freezing air. She saw Gideon standing by the window, leaning on his crutch, his face pale in the moonlight. She walked over to him. She didn't coddle him. She didn't ask if he was all right. She simply handed him the shotgun. "I missed the second one," she said quietly, her breath pluming in the cold air. "The recoil is heavier than the Colt." Gideon looked at the shotgun in his hands. Then he looked deep into her eyes. He saw the fire, the exhaustion, and the absolute, unyielding strength of the woman who had saved his life and his kingdom. He reached out, dropped the shotgun onto the bed, and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her. It wasn't the polite, chaste kiss of a gentleman courting a parlor girl. It was desperate. It was profound. It was the kiss of a man who realized he had found an absolute equal in a world that demanded perfection. Beatrice kissed him back, her cold hands gripping the collar of his shirt. She had arrived looking for a husband. She had wanted someone to carry her burdens, to shield her from the harsh realities of life, and to provide a safe, predictable existence. She had wanted the illusion. But life on the edge of the wild world does not permit illusions. It forces you to drop the heavy, useless baggage of your expectations. It forces you to realize that true security is never found in someone else's strength. True security is found in the terrifying, magnificent moment you realize your own strength is enough. Gideon Hayes never became the flawless, towering protector Beatrice had imagined on the train, and Beatrice Alden never became the quiet, compliant domestic wife Gideon had ordered from a catalog. Instead, they became a force of nature. They ruled their Colorado empire side by side, 2 heavily scarred generals who knew that when the wolves came to the door, neither of them would hide behind the other. Because the best things in life are never the things you ordered. They are the things that force you to become the person you were always meant to be. If this story made you question the traditional roles we play in our own lives, I want you to think about something. Think about the moment Beatrice walked into that kitchen, put the revolver on the ledger, and fired the ranch hands. Was she acting out of fear, or was she finally acting out of true, unchained power? What would you have done in her place? Leave a comment down below and tell me your thoughts. Sometimes the most honest conversations happen right there in the comments. Let's talk about it.